The story began on a cold October morning in 1888, when 30 hunters marched into the Ozark Woods with rifles on their backs and confidence in their steps, unaware that the forest had been waiting for them. Locals swore the trees had grown thicker that year, their trunks twisted like knotted fingers, their shadows stretching longer than the sun should allow. Livestock had been vanishing without a trace, and strange calls echoed through the hollows at night, calls that sounded almost human, but not quite. It was enough to stir fear even in men who had spent their whole lives navigating these wild Missouri ridges. Yet fear was not enough to stop them. They believed they were tracking a bear, or maybe a pack of wolves driven mad by hunger. But as they crossed the river and felt the temperature drop as if they'd stepped into another season, a quiet unease settled over the group. The forest felt wrong. The air too heavy. The silence too complete. Even the leaves under their boots seemed to resist making sound. One of the men joked that the woods were holding their breath. No one laughed. The deeper they went, the more each man felt a strange pressure behind his ears, as though someone was whispering from just out of reach. They didn't speak of it, but every one of them heard it. By nightfall, the sky had turned a color the men didn't recognize, a bruised shade of purple that made the treetops look like silhouettes of crooked hands. They built a fire, but the flames flickered weakly, refusing to burn bright. Something watched them from the dark, they felt it long before they saw anything. A shape shifted between the trees, tall and narrow, moving with a slow patience, as if studying the hunters one by one. When the first whisper rose from the darkness, calling a man's name in his mother's voice, the hunters finally understood what they had stepped into. The woods were not empty. They were occupied by something that had learned to speak. And by the next morning, one of the 30 was gone. The gathering of the 30 hunters began as nothing more than a necessary response to fear, frustration, and pride. Throughout the Missouri Ozarks, livestock had been disappearing in the weeks before October of 1888, leaving farmers confused and angry as they discovered torn fences, deep claw marks on tree trunks, and the eerie absence of tracks leading away from the scenes. Word traveled quickly through neighboring towns, and the same unsettling stories echoed from household to household: animals vanishing without a trace, dogs refusing to go near the woods, and strange noises coming from the ridges long after sunset. In isolated communities where every head of cattle mattered and every barn depended on self-reliance, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to survival. Men who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united by a single growing suspicion that something was stalking the outskirts of civilization. When the call was made for volunteers to track down whatever was lurking in the forest, the response was overwhelming. 30 hunters, experienced, hardened, and proud of their knowledge of the land, stepped forward to form what they believed would be the largest and most capable hunting party the region had seen in years. Some were motivated by duty to protect their families, others by the challenge of facing a predator bold enough to taunt entire towns. A few were drawn by more personal reasons, such as the hope of reclaiming lost pride or proving themselves in front of their peers. Whatever their motivations, they gathered at the meeting point with rifles gleaming, boots laced tight, and the confidence of men who had spent their whole lives reading the woods like a second language. Their pact was simple: they would not return until they found the creature responsible for the disappearances. Some believed it was a bear forced out of its usual territory by early frost. Others insisted it had to be a mountain lion or a desperate pack of wolves with a taste for easy prey. A handful whispered theories about something far stranger. An older local legend revived after decades of silence, but those whispers were quickly dismissed with laughter. The idea that anything supernatural could be involved was too absurd for a group of practical men defined by grit and logic. Yet even while they laughed, there was something tense about the way they stood, each one glancing occasionally toward the tree line as though expecting the forest to lunge forward. Before stepping into the woods, they joined hands in a rough circle, not out of ritual but necessity, each man swearing he would not abandon the others no matter what they found in the darkness waiting ahead. The forest greeted the hunters with a strangeness they felt before they fully understood it. As the 30 men crossed deeper into the Ozark Woods, the familiar sounds they had grown up with, the rustling of squirrels, the chatter of birds, the distant cry of a hawk, slowly faded until the silence became so complete it felt unnatural. Even in early autumn, these woods were never quiet, they were usually alive with noise, a constant chorus that every hunter knew by heart. But now, it was as if the entire forest were holding itself still, watching, waiting, and listening to the intruders disturb the ground. Some of the men paused, glancing around as if trying to spot the source of the sudden hush, but all they found were trees standing motionless and shadows stretching unnaturally long between their trunks. A few tried to dismiss it as luck, saying maybe the wildlife had migrated or been scared off by the group's combined footsteps. But the explanations didn't ease the uneasy feeling that pulsed through the group. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrongly quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes you feel as though something is inches away from you, just outside your field of vision. One hunter, Amos Tate, who had spent nearly 50 years in the Missouri backwoods, muttered that the forest felt empty in the way a church feels empty after midnight, and though no one responded, several men found themselves instinctively gripping their rifles tighter. With every step, the silence seemed to deepen. Leaves under their boots barely crackled, as though damp even though the soil was dry. The wind, which had been steady outside the tree line, vanished completely once they crossed into the thicker parts of the woods. The air felt dense, cold, and oddly still, as though the forest itself was resisting movement. A few men noticed something even more unsettling: their breathing sounded too loud. Every exhale echoed faintly, bouncing back at them in a way that made them feel exposed. The sensation grew until one man whispered that the woods felt alive, like it was swallowing their sound and feeding on it. Though none of them said it out loud, each hunter felt the same strange pressure settling on them, a kind of tightening in the chest that didn't come from fear alone. It felt like the woods were observing them, absorbing them, and deciding whether they were welcome. The deeper they walked, the more convinced they became that they were no longer surrounded by ordinary trees but by something aware, something ancient, something waiting just beyond the limits of their senses. As dusk began to settle over the Ozark Woods, the hunters grew increasingly aware of a new presence in the silence, something subtle at first, like the faint shifting of air between the trees, but soon transforming into a sound that none of them wanted to acknowledge. It began with a soft murmur carried through the branches, a tone too low to distinguish but too deliberate to ignore. The men halted, turning slowly in different directions, trying to find the source. The sound came again, clearer this time, and though each man swore it was near him, no two agreed on where it originated. It was as if the forest had found a voice and was experimenting with how to use it. They looked to one another for confirmation, each hoping the others hadn't heard it, but the wide-eyed stares told them they all had. At first, some insisted it was the wind playing tricks, yet the trees remained still, their branches rigid, their leaves unmoving. The whispers seemed to drift in a circular pattern, weaving between the trunks as though intentionally avoiding a fixed position. One man, Harold Sutton, raised his lantern and scanned the woods, swearing he'd heard someone say his name. Another hunter, Elijah Boone, muttered that he'd heard his name too but claimed the voice sounded like someone he hadn't seen in years, someone long dead. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to mock the men. Not out here. Not with the forest swallowing their every sound and returning only these strange murmurs. The whispers grew bolder as the light faded, forming patterns, almost rhythmic, like a conversation happening just out of reach. Certain words seemed to surface from the hum, fragments that felt familiar but distorted, as though spoken by a tongue and used to forming human sounds. Some of the hunters covered their ears, only to discover the whispers didn't stop, they simply moved inward, as if echoing directly inside their skulls. The sensation was unnerving, a faint vibration behind the eyes that made even the bravest among them shift uneasily. More unsettling was the realization that the whispers weren't random. They were targeted. One man would hear faint laughter behind him while another would hear a slow, drawn-out breathing inches from his side. When they spun around, expecting to find an animal or, worse, another man playing a cruel trick, they saw nothing but the empty spaces between the trees. The forest seemed to mimic voices the men trusted, stitching together tones and cadences pulled from memories they hadn't shared. A mother calling her son. A brother teasing from across a field. A wife whispering late at night. These familiar echoes twisted into something hollow and predatory, leaving the men standing stiff with dread, each wondering how the forest knew their names at all. As night settled heavily over the woods, the hunters decided to make camp in a small clearing that offered just enough space for their tents and a central fire. They gathered fallen branches and dry leaves, building a pile that should have produced a strong, warm blaze. Yet from the moment they struck the first spark, something felt wrong. The fire caught, but instead of burning with the bright orange and gold they expected, the flames flickered in an unnatural shade, pale, almost bluish, like fire starved of air. A few men muttered nervously, claiming it must be the dampness in the wood, but their voices carried the kind of uncertainty that betrayed their true fear. Even the crackling sounded muted, as though muffled by an unseen hand pressing down on it. They added more fuel, but the flames refused to grow. The fire sputtered, flaring weakly before dipping into a sickly glow that cast long, trembling shadows across the ground. The men huddled closer, not because the fire offered warmth, it didn't, but because the darkness surrounding the clearing felt thick, as if trying to encroach upon their circle. The air grew colder, sharper, almost metallic in the lungs. When one man reached out toward the flame with his palm, expecting heat, he drew back in confusion. It was warm but nowhere near as hot as a fire of its size should have been. The forest around them remained eerily still, watching their struggle with a quiet that felt mocking. Then the fire dimmed even further, as though a great breath had swept across it. But there was no wind. Not a leaf fluttered, not a branch swayed. The hunters exchanged looks, realizing simultaneously that something was affecting the flame. It behaved like a living thing being smothered, shrinking in upon itself. The shadows pushed closer, creeping with a slow, deliberate movement that made several men instinctively step back. The dim light distorted their faces into hollow versions of themselves, carving deep lines and darkening their eyes until each of them looked haunted. As the fire weakened, the whispers they had heard earlier seemed to return, but this time they were quieter, more intimate, threading through the clearing like invisible fingers brushing against their ears. The men strained to listen, hoping to catch a word or meaning, but the sounds remained just beyond comprehension. Some hunters began to shake, others swore under their breath, and a few reached for their rifles even though there was nothing visible to shoot at. With each passing minute, the light retreated until the fire became little more than a ghostly ember, struggling against the encroaching dark. The moment the final flicker threatened to disappear, the men understood with growing terror that whatever waited beyond the weak glow of their camp wanted them swallowed by the darkness entirely. The first disappearance happened so quietly, so seamlessly, that for several long minutes no one even realized a man was missing. The hunters had clustered together near the dying fire, speaking in low, uneasy voices as they debated whether to move camp or stay where they were until dawn. The atmosphere was stretched thin with fear, but none of them were willing to admit it out loud. They stood so close to one another that the slightest shuffle of boots could be mistaken for someone shifting positions, and in that closeness, the absence of a single man went unnoticed. It wasn't until Amos Tate asked for Tom Hargrove's opinion on relocating that the silence grew sharper. No answer came. Amos called his name again, louder this time, and still there was nothing. A few of the hunters turned their lanterns outward, sweeping the dim glow across the trees, expecting to find Tom standing just beyond the circle of men relieving himself or checking the perimeter. But the light revealed only empty space, and the unease that had been lingering all night sank deeper into their bones. They started calling his name, at first in irritation, then in genuine fear. Tom wasn't the kind of man to wander off alone without telling anyone. He was steady, reliable, and deeply cautious, traits that made his sudden absence all the more disturbing. A few hunters ventured several yards into the surrounding darkness, lanterns raised, calling out to him with strained voices. The forest swallowed their shouts without echo, as though absorbing the sound before it could travel. The silence that followed each call was heavier than before, as if the woods were listening closely, savoring their panic. In desperation, someone fired a shot into the air, hoping the noise would scare off whatever might be nearby or prompt Tom to respond. But the gunshot faded unnaturally fast, clipped short by the stillness that hung between the trees. When they finally found something, it wasn't Tom. Near a large ash tree just a few feet beyond the edge of their camp lay his rifle, propped neatly against the trunk, barrel pointing skyward, still warm to the touch. The placement was too deliberate to be accidental. Tom would never have set his weapon down in the middle of the night, not with something stalking the woods and certainly not without telling the others. There were no footprints leading away from the spot, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist, lifted silently from the ground while standing within arm's reach of his companions. The men stared at the rifle in stunned disbelief, each of them understanding the same terrifying truth. Whatever had taken Tom had done so without a sound, without leaving a trace, and with an intelligence that suggested it knew exactly how close it could get without being seen. The hunters waited until daylight before attempting to move deeper into the woods in search of Tom, but the moment they began retracing their steps, something felt fundamentally different. The path they had taken the day before, one they remembered clearly, marked by specific bends in the underbrush and a fallen oak they had stepped over, no longer appeared the same. Trees they were certain had been on their left now stood to their right. The ground sloped in the opposite direction. Even the familiar ridge line that should have been visible through the breaks in the canopy had vanished behind a wall of dense timber that none of them recalled passing. At first, they accused each other of misremembering, but 30 seasoned woodsmen didn't all forget the same landmarks overnight, and the more they argued, the more obvious it became that the forest itself had shifted around them. In an effort to steady their nerves, the men looked for the markings they had carved into tree trunks as a precaution. Several of the more experienced hunters had sliced deep X-shaped cuts into bark along the way, ensuring they would know their route back. But when they found those trees again, the marks were gone. The bark was smooth, undisturbed, as though the wood had healed itself or the carvings had never existed. Confusion turned quickly into dread as they began checking tree after tree, only to discover the same impossibility each time. The forest was erasing their presence. One man whispered that the woods were alive, changing, rearranging like a maze built with intelligence rather than chance. The others didn't laugh. They couldn't. The deeper they pushed, the more disoriented they became. Trails twisted into unfamiliar directions, looping back on themselves in a way that defied natural geography. Wide clearings narrowed into tight corridors of brush. Sunlight filtered strangely through the canopy, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, flickering as though filtered through moving branches even when no wind stirred the leaves. The men found themselves circling the same strange knot of roots multiple times, even though they had been walking straight. Panic began to seep in, quiet but persistent. Their compasses spun weakly, the needles trembling instead of pointing north. A few hunters swore the trees subtly moved positions when no one was looking, but no one dared confirm it aloud. At one point, Elijah Boone placed a stone on the ground beside a mossy stump to test whether the forest truly was shifting. They marched forward for half an hour, only to step into an oddly familiar clearing. There, beside the same mossy stump, lay the same stone, resting exactly where he had left it. The realization struck all of them at once: they were walking, but they were not traveling. The forest was folding around them, redirecting their steps, pulling them inward no matter how determinedly they fought against it. And as the shadows stretched longer and the paths became more tangled, each hunter began to understand that whatever had taken Tom was now guiding them toward something deeper, something they had never meant to find. The first scream shattered the heavy silence of the forest so violently that several of the hunters dropped to their knees, convinced a man had been ripped apart somewhere nearby. It wasn't just loud, it was layered, jagged, and carried a pitch that clawed straight through bone. The sound rolled across the trees like a human voice twisted into something grotesque, echoing with a depth that didn't belong to any creature they knew. For a split second it resembled a man calling for help, but the longer it echoed, the clearer it became that no human lungs could have created such a sound. It rose and fell in unnatural waves, stretching syllables into distorted tones that suggested not one voice, but many speaking at once. The hunters looked at one another, the realization hitting them at the same time: whatever they were hearing wasn't begging, it was hunting. The scream came again, closer this time, and it carried with it a strange resonance, like wood groaning under pressure or bones snapping in a distant echo. One hunter, Jonathan Miles, clapped his hands over his ears and cursed, insisting the scream sounded like his younger brother calling his name. Another swore it sounded like his own voice bouncing back at him from across the trees. As each man struggled to make sense of what he heard, the forest seemed to toy with them, bending the sound in different directions, making it impossible to know where it originated. They spun around in frantic confusion, rifles raised, lamplight shaking, but the woods offered no target, only the oppressive darkness pressing close around them. Then came the laughter, thin, brittle, and horribly human, yet wrong in a way that made the skin crawl. It trickled between the trees like a cold draft, carrying hints of mockery and hunger. One moment it sounded like a child, the next like a grown man, then something ancient and broken, layered with tones that made the hunters' stomachs twist. The laughter abruptly shifted into a chorus of sobbing, dozens of voices crying at once, each overlapping the other in a way that made it impossible to distinguish individual sounds. Some hunters shouted to drown it out, desperate to break the eerie harmony, but their own voices dissolved into the forest as if swallowed whole. As the echoes died away, the woods did not return to silence. Instead, low, guttural breathing began to circle the camp, slow, rhythmic inhales and exhales, each breath deliberate and heavy. It felt close, impossibly close, as though the thing was standing just outside the reach of their lanterns, waiting for one of them to step forward. No one moved. The forest was no longer simply watching them, it was speaking in borrowed voices, mimicking human sounds as if trying to lure them deeper into its grasp. And within that chorus of screams, laughter, and sobbing, the men sensed an intelligence, cold, ancient, and endlessly patient, studying them with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. When the hunters stumbled into the clearing, they felt it before they fully saw it, a coldness that didn't belong to the surrounding woods, a stillness so severe it pressed down on their chests. The trees around the open space grew in a perfect circle, unnaturally straight, as if something had forced them into alignment long ago. Not a single leaf moved on their branches, and even the insects that had occasionally dared to chirp during the night were silent here. The men stepped forward cautiously, lanterns raised, trying to understand why the forest had led them to this place. Then the light revealed the ground, and several of them recoiled in shock. Scattered across the clearing were bones, hundreds of them, arranged with deliberate precision. At first the men thought they belonged to deer, judging by the shattered antlers piled in jagged heaps. But among them lay human-like bones, long, thin, and unnervingly clean, their surfaces stripped of any flesh or markings except for deep symmetrical grooves that looked carved rather than chewed. No animal in the Ozarks could have done this. No creature sorted bones by size. No predator arranged them in spiraling patterns that converged toward the hollow base of a towering oak at the center of the clearing. The oak itself was unlike any tree the hunters had ever seen. Its bark was thick and dark, cracked in places like the surface of dried mud, and at its base was an opening, a hollow so deep their lantern light couldn't reach its end. Around the hollow lay the circle of bones, placed with a precision that hinted at ritual, intention, and intelligence. One man whispered that it looked like a warning. Another whispered that it looked like a door. Neither explanation offered comfort. The hunters approached cautiously, their boots crunching loudly on the brittle antler fragments that snapped under their weight. Every sound they made seemed too loud in this deadened space, as though their presence violated the clearing's purpose. A few men knelt to inspect the bones, hoping to find clues that could explain the carvings. What they discovered instead were patterns, symbols etched into the fragments, repeating shapes that resembled twisting lines and spirals, unlike any markings made by knife, claw, or natural break. As they examined them, several hunters felt a strange pull from the hollow in the oak, a cold draft that moved as if it were breathing softly from within. The draft carried a faint smell, earthy and faintly metallic, the kind of scent associated with something old that had been buried too long. The more they looked, the more obvious it became that the clearing was not a place where life ended by accident. It was a place where something collected, categorized, and consumed. And it had not only handled animals. The presence of human bones, too clean, too deliberately placed, made the truth sickeningly clear. They were not the first people to be led into this part of the woods. And the forest, with its shifting paths and whispering voices, was guiding them toward the same fate. The 6 remaining hunters barricaded themselves inside the shallow cave with the desperation of men who finally understood that whatever stalked them wasn't an animal, wasn't a man, and didn't belong to any world they knew. The moment they crossed the threshold of the rocky shelter, the temperature dropped so sharply that their breath fogged in front of them. The cave was narrow, barely wide enough for them to sit shoulder to shoulder, its walls damp and uneven. They dragged fallen branches, packs, and loose stones to block the entrance, building a makeshift barrier with trembling hands. No one spoke. They were all listening for the return of the thing they had felt following them since they left the bone circle behind. Every small sound made their hearts jump, the scrape of fabric, the settling of pebbles, the nervous tap of a rifle stock against the floor. But soon those small noises were drowned out by something far heavier. It began with slow, deliberate footsteps right outside the cave. Not the subtle shuffle of an animal, but steps placed with intention. The weight behind each one suggested something tall, perhaps impossibly tall, and its pace bore the patience of a predator confident in its victory. The hunters froze, afraid even to breathe. Then came the whispers, weaving through the air like threads of cold smoke. They weren't distant this time. They were right at the cave mouth. Voices layered over one another, speaking in tones that shifted from soft to guttural, from familiar to completely alien. Some of the hunters heard their wives calling them home. Others heard their fathers shouting warnings from decades past. One man whispered through chattering teeth that he heard his own voice whispering back to him, saying things he had never spoken in his life. The footsteps circled the cave slowly, dragging along the outer stone wall, moving in a pattern too controlled to be random. Something brushed against the entrance barrier, a gentle press at first, testing the strength of the branches, then a slow upward scrape that made the entire structure quiver. The sound reminded them of claws, or fingers, or something in between. The whispers grew louder, swelling like a tide. They didn't echo inside or outside the cave, they seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating in the hunters' bones rather than their ears. Several men began to pray under their breath, their voices trembling uncontrollably, but the whispers only slipped between their words, repeating them mockingly in tones that stripped them of all meaning. Hours passed, or minutes, they couldn't tell. Time dissolved under the pressure of fear. Then the breathing began. Deep, cavernous breaths right outside the entrance, each exhale cold enough that a faint frost formed on the inner stones. The hunters stared at the barrier, rifles raised, knowing that nothing between them and the creature was strong enough to withstand a determined push. The breathing drew closer, slower, savoring their terror, as if the thing was leaning in, listening to their pounding hearts, deciding which one it would take first. As dawn finally bled across the horizon, the survivors in the cave realized with a sinking dread that the faint morning light brought no safety. The whispers had faded sometime before sunrise, and the slow, deliberate breaths outside the cave had stopped so abruptly that the silence felt even more suffocating than the creature's presence. For a long time none of the hunters dared to move, afraid the stillness was a trick, another one of the forest's cruel illusions meant to lure them out. But the cold creeping deeper into their bones forced them to make a choice. Remaining in the cave meant freezing or starving, and they knew the thing outside was patient enough to wait. So, with trembling hands and hollow eyes, they began to dismantle the barrier piece by piece, each crack of wood echoing too loudly in the unnatural quiet. The world outside looked unchanged at first glance, the same trees, the same moss-covered stones, but a strange emptiness lingered in the air, as if the forest were restraining itself, watching them with a predator's anticipation. The 6 men stepped cautiously into the clearing, clutching their rifles and darting glances between the shadowed trunks. For a moment, they dared to believe the creature had lost interest, perhaps satisfied with the ones it had already taken. But hope died the moment they saw the footprints. Not human. Not animal. Dozens of them, arranged in a spiraling path around the cave entrance, each print elongated, 3-toed, and deep enough to have compressed the earth as though something impossibly heavy had passed through. The trail led away from the cave, but only for a few yards. Then the prints abruptly stopped, disappearing into untouched soil, as though whatever made them had lifted itself straight into the air. The hunters pressed forward, driven by equal parts fear and determination, but the forest no longer behaved like a place they recognized. The trees leaned in unnatural angles, their branches twisting toward the men as if straining to listen. The light filtering through the canopy dimmed without warning, blanching the colors from the world until everything looked washed out and lifeless. One of the men, overcome by panic, broke into a sprint, insisting he saw an opening in the woods ahead. The others followed, desperate for escape, but the ground beneath them began to shift subtly, softening like damp earth even though it remained dry. The path wavered, bending in directions that made no sense. The forest was moving again, sealing exits, guiding them with quiet purpose. As they stumbled deeper, they heard it, the faintest whisper, drifting from everywhere and nowhere. Not a lure this time, but something like a farewell, as though the forest already knew the outcome. The sound grew clearer the farther they ran, until it resolved into a single truth spoken in a voice that did not belong to any living thing. They were not being chased. They were being returned to the place where all the others before them had vanished, drawn back into the heart of the woods where the creature waited, patient and hungry, ready to complete what it had started.